One of the questions that we get, and often it's not really a question, it's more of sort of a bold, angry accusation from many professing Christians, and it's this: doesn't your open air preaching drive people away from Jesus Christ? We might be at a baseball game. We might be at a downtown festival. We might be at a park where there's many crowds. We might be at a train station where people are getting off work and they're heading home, and we're preaching the gospel. And sometimes there are professing Christians that go to churches, and they come right in your face, and they'll have their finger out and they'll be pointing right at you, and they'll say, "You are driving people away from Jesus by what you're doing." Often, that's what is said. And I want to address this both negatively and positively, because it's a very common objection from many professing Christians, and it stems from a few faulty assumptions. And I have to bring those out. Number one, the first faulty assumption is that people can actually be driven away further than they already are. That's a false assumption. That by what I or any street preacher might be doing, that you're driving people further away than they already are. That's a wrong doctrine of biblical anthropology, because the doctrine of man must be biblically understood. It's a false understanding of biblical hamartiology, the doctrine of sin. A second faulty assumption is this: your preaching doesn't work. You're preaching in the open air. First, it's driving people away. But second, a faulty assumption is that your preaching doesn't work. Preaching doesn't work anymore. Which leads to a third faulty assumption. We need to find, or we need to create, or we need to invent or craft a new way to sort of meet people where they are and deliver the gospel of God's grace. We got to tell people that they love them and build relationships first, because after all, that's how people are going to trust you. That's a faulty assumption. Number four, we need to address the fourth faulty assumption, and it's this: that we could actually do something to help contribute to drawing people to Christ. That's a very faulty assumption. That's a faulty assumption of the doctrine of man, the doctrine of sin, the doctrine of God, the doctrine of the Spirit, the doctrine of salvation, the doctrine of God, and the doctrine of Christ. All of those doctrines are connected to this. It is very faulty to think that you could actually do something by your friendship or by your reaching out to people in sort of a loving, tender, compassionate way to help contribute to draw someone to God. But I want to address that whole issue of, but your open-air preaching drives people away. I've addressed it negatively. Let me now talk about it positively. Let me give four thoughts regarding this. Number one, we need to understand that humanity, mankind, is so sinful and so bad and so unable to come to God that he cannot be driven farther away than he already is. He's already dead. And all men already naturally in their sinful estate, they hate God. They're at enmity with God. And they don't want God. And they're not seeking God. We also need to bring out a second thought here. Preaching always works. And to qualify that, the right kind of faithful preaching always works. Insofar as a man is preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ and declaring the glory of God and the work of God in Jesus Christ as he atoned for the sins of his people, and that all men everywhere must repent and they must trust in Jesus Christ and count the cost and follow him, that's a faithful gospel. We need to remember that preaching always works. Number three, we must remember that we don't need to find or create or invent or craft a new way to reach people with the gospel. We don't need to do that. God has already declared very clearly in the Bible. But you, 2 Timothy 4:5, endure hardship, be sober in all things, endure hardship, do the work of an evangelist, fulfill your ministry. Preach the word, he said earlier. Be ready in season and out of season. Reprove, rebuke, exhort with great patience and instruction. And then fourth and positively, we have to remember this: we obey Christ our Master. And we obey his command to preach and not man's opinions as to whether they think open-air preaching works, whether they think open-air preaching is effective or not. We're not going to obey men and whether they think that it's driving people away. We're going to obey God. And God, in His great love and His great grace and in His clear declaration in the Word, He says, go preach the gospel to every creature. He says, go into the highways and the hedges and compel them to come in so that my house may be full. Doesn't open-air preaching drive people away from Jesus? Never. Because all lost people, all non-believers, could never be driven farther away than they already are. Because in their unbelief, they already are dead in their sin. They already are at enmity with God. They love their sin and they hate God. They could never be driven farther away than they already are. That's a common objection, but that's a faithful answer, I think, to a common question that many people have about your preaching driving people farther away from the gospel.